Good afternoon. My name is Lourenço Garcia. I am the Assistant Superintendent of Revere Public Schools. I will be the moderator for tonight's panel discussion. This year's Indigenous Peoples Day falls on Monday, October 10th. The day is significant in the sense that it honors the Native American contributions to medicine, food, and heritage. Ironically, the date coincides with Columbus Day, a national holiday celebrated in the United States and many countries in the Americas, which in recent years has prompted political debate in states, cities, and municipalities favoring Indigenous Peoples Day. Indigenous Peoples Day was first celebrated at the International Conference on Discrimination sponsored by the United Nations in 1977. In the United States, South Dakota was the first state to recognize the day in 1989, followed by the cities of Berkeley and Santa Cruz, California. Today, more than 130 cities in the United States, including Arlington, Amherst, Cambridge, Brookline, Marblehead, Great Barrington, Northampton, Provincetown, Somerville, Salem, and most recently, Boston, celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day. Although the number of states and cities recognizing the legacy and impact of colonialism on the indigenous people, as well as their culture, contributions, and resilience in the face of diversity, is on the rise, critics argue that federal and local governments need to do more. Native Americans, whom Columbus called Indians, have built thriving and diverse communities across our country. In fact, they are credited with bringing significant contributions to food and medicine. For example, 60% of the food we consume today stem from American indigenous diets. For over 5 centuries, indigenous people have been fighting for their survival, land, and rights. Unfortunately, harsh and discriminatory federal and policies and practices have displaced and dispossessed them through land grabbing and eradication of their heritage and identity. Despite these challenges and adversities, indigenous people have shown resilience and strength in their journey towards social justice and affirmation of their cultural identity. Joining me this afternoon are 4 distinguished panelists who will spend some time educating and sharing insights with us on the significance of the Indigenous Peoples Day. Now we're going to take a few minutes for the panelists to introduce themselves.
Kwai, Awani Strong Oak. Welcome everyone, greetings. I am the Executive Director and founder of the Visioning Bear Circle Intertribal Coalition, and I'm a member of the Kawasik Traditional Band of Sovereign Abenaki Nation of New Hampshire. I have many other tribal affiliations other than the Abenaki, which include the Maliseet and Mi'kmaq. I co-authored a Walking in Balance curriculum. It's really based on the 7 grandfather teachings, and it's a violence prevention program based on the traditional values of indigenous people before colonization. And it focuses on decolonizing indigenous peoples and reclaiming historical ways of being in the community. And it can also be used to understand structural racism and its impact in communities today.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Elaine Madera-Jean, and I'm of Indigenous descent. I'm from the Midwest. I'm very much a proponent of the land back movement and of tribal sovereignty, and also forefronting Native voices. Currently, I'm a teacher at Revere High School. I teach level 1 ELL students, and I have for the past 6 years.
Hello, Revere. My name is Ethan Costello. I teach world history and English language and composition at Revere High School. I've been teaching in Revere since I graduated from Salem State, where I studied American legal history, political science, and education. And really, my interest is in public memory versus history. So public memory, a society's common, often not quite accurate understanding of what happened in the past, and the real history based on sources and evidence and trying to tell the most complete and accurate story. And that's kind of what I'm most interested in. I've taught several generations of Revere students, and I've been teaching in Revere since 2012.
Hi everyone, my name is Jaleeyah Figueroa. I am a freshman at Revere High School, and I'm an active member of the Equity Board.
To begin this evening's panel discussion, Strong Oak will lead us to the land acknowledgement to recognize Indigenous peoples as the de stewards of this land and the enduring relationships that exist between them and their traditional territories. Land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on. Indigenous people have been living and working on the land from the time immemorial.
We would like to acknowledge the first inhabitants here in Revere, where we are now meeting. They were the Pawtucket tribe, and they were known by the colonists as the Rumney Marsh Indians, and they were named by an English person named Romney Marsh in Kent, England. So that alone, so we just need to acknowledge that these first inhabitants that were Pawtucket Indians, they were also Abenaki, and they would not have referred to themselves as the Romney or the Rumney Marsh Indians, but nonetheless. And right now, they are not recognized as a tribe, but I would counter to say they still exist here. And right now, the federally recognized tribes in our area are the Wampanoag and the Nipmuc. And so with that, we would just want to honor those first inhabitants that while they have not been acknowledged in the past, they are now being acknowledged now, and all across the country, people are acknowledging the first peoples of the land on which they are as a matter of respect.
Thank you for that acknowledgement. I know that land and water carry a significant spiritual meaning for the Indigenous people. Now, we have several questions for our panelists, and I will start with the first question. What's the importance of Indigenous Peoples Day?
I think, interestingly, one of the important factors in the importance of Indigenous Peoples Day is surprisingly not too different from the original intent of Columbus Day, where it's about recognition. Whereas Italian-American immigrants took this idea that had existed in the United States of Columbus as the discoverer, Columbus as somewhat of a hero, and through the Knights of Columbus, used that to push for more recognition and for a holiday to recognize this group that did suffer discrimination and oppression. The creation of Columbus Day was opposed by anti-immigrant groups and anti-Catholic groups, including the Ku Klux Klan. So interestingly, Columbus Day itself was controversial simply to exist in the beginning. So I do feel that it's about recognition of people not receiving proper recognition. I do feel that the injustices faced by Indigenous people are of a vastly different scale, but I do think that it's important to keep that in mind. And really, I think who I most want to hear from here are our panelists of Indigenous descent on this question.
When I think of Columbus Day, I'm thinking what comes to my mind is this is a conversation between immigrants, and that has been forefronted. So it's different immigrant groups at odds with each other, all having their own agenda. Now, when we take that and turn that on its head, we're finally bringing some recognition to the indigenous people who have always been here. And we refer to the United States of America as Turtle Island. So this is taking the focus off of immigrants and their conversation and bringing it back to the original inhabitants. So that, to me, in a nutshell, is what it speaks to.
Following up on what Elena just said, I was thinking about why it's important to talk about Indigenous Peoples Day is to acknowledge that there were 40 million Indigenous people here before anybody from European descent came. And Columbus, everyone knows that he got lost on his way. And then he met people in the Caribbean, actually, and those people did not have weapons of mass destruction. They were really welcoming, and they were curious about who the people were that were coming in. Indigenous people already had a conception of non-ownership of land, and they would have been naturally curious. And they also believed that Mother Earth had the same rights as anyone, and that all beings had the same rights as every other being. So when they first met them, what Columbus noticed is they didn't have any weapons and they were friendly. And when he went back, he said, "This is easy for the taking." And I think there are some direct quotes from him that state that. And then they came up with a plausible reason why they could take the land. And I think later on with the questions, we'll probably get to some of the impacts and connections with what's going on today. But I would end there to say that these two cultures had nothing in common, and they didn't have a pathway for discussion because the people who came really considered ownership of land as paramount. They were colonizers after all. And then the next thing they wanted to do was come up with a plausible reason why they could come here and just take it.
I think that it's about Indigenous people who have been strong and resilient for years after, for decades, a man went to their home and claimed to have found it on his own. And all their credit and hard work was given to a man by the name of Columbus. And I think that it can add into society today because now, after so much time has passed, they're finally getting the recognition that they deserve.
Thank you all for that perspective. And now we're going to build on that and ask you the following questions. What do you think of the argument of changing the name and focus on the holiday from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day?
I guess when I feel that changing the name and changing the focus, it's going to take a lot of time. I mean, it can be done, but for this actually to resonate with people is going to take a long time. I don't see it as having a direct impact on Indigenous communities because I think that they have to act proactively as far as moving forward with their own way of decolonizing. However, having said that, I believe it is the right thing to do. It should have been done long ago. In my opinion, it never should have existed. But as I said, it's the right thing to do. And it's just going to take a while for this to sift down into the consciousness of American people.
One of the things I would like to share about this is I think it really is important to have a holiday for Indigenous people as a matter of respect. For one thing, the man that's being honored on this day, Columbus, has a very checkered past of oppression and comes directly from oppression because what the whole premise around which he was given permission to come here and colonize stemmed from a papal bull in 1493 that said that they had a right to take land away from people who were not Christians and to call them barbarian, and that they could enslave people into perpetuity under this et cetera bull, which also, coupled with the doctrine of discovery, said that anybody who wasn't Christian you could take their lands from them. And this was a lot of countries. It was Africa, Australia, and others. I mean, the United States wasn't the only one, and in Canada, and just to take everybody's land who wasn't Christian to build that empire, and to say that you are a better person, and it was your manifest destiny, because those are things we see in the history books about manifest destiny, that a superior group of people were supposed to take all of this land. So to venerate a person called Columbus. And there's even documented that they did a lot of sexual assault as part of the colonization. So you're literally venerating and honoring a person who got lost, who stole land, and actually was guilty of rapes in the process. And to have that person be even the city or a state or a road is actually hurtful to Indigenous peoples.
I think one point here is that I do believe that the idea of Columbus Day has very little, if nothing, to do with the man called Christopher Columbus who existed and did all of these atrocities, very strangely, because I think this does come down to the historical memory. And when this became a holiday, there was a myth about Columbus that was perpetuated and believed, and really that's what people were celebrating. I think it's only recently, now that this has become a controversy, that people really want to debate all these fine points about what he did and didn't do, and was he present for this or wasn't he present for that. But I do think that most people that are in favor of Columbus Day are not in favor of genocide or sexual assault or anything like that. And I think that's just important to say before we kind of get into the weeds, but I do think that as far as the atrocities, and there are, many different historians will take different perspectives on this, but I think that the most generous interpretation of the history for Columbus was that he was an incredibly good navigator. That's the one thing that he did well, was a navigator. That's it. And the most generous interpretation of the atrocities was that he was such a poor manager that if he didn't do them personally, his poor managerial skills allowed them to take place with impunity. Mm-hmm. That's the best case scenario.
Christopher Columbus, the man, the myth has certainly eclipsed who he was, and it's what he represents. I think he has become far beyond what that person was. The people who have stood on his shoulders and used him as justification for doing what they've done. Okay, so the concept of Christopher Columbus has become extremely embedded in the American psyche. And it has given generations to exploit and to destroy Indigenous culture, language, take their children away, put them in the government-run, residential boarding schools that operated up through the 1970s at least, and in the 90s up in Canada. So we're looking at, like I said, this whole concept of Christopher Columbus has certainly, it's springboarded off of him. And like I said, it has become the pathway for people to use to oppress Indigenous people.
One of the things, even beyond the specifics that he and his crew and his expeditions did, was just the sort of the ideology that they were bringing with them. They were bringing with them an idea of race that was new to the world at that point, an idea of there being superior and inferior based on where people lived and their culture and their skin color, which was new to the world, really. I mean, often one of the arguments, and I don't want to set up and break down too many straw men, but one of the arguments that again for Columbus is that, well, everybody was doing slavery at the time, so it's not that big of a deal. But in fact, this new idea of actually owning people because they are not Christian and not the same race was new within 20 years before this. It started in Portugal with a writer named Zurara, who wrote about Africa as having people that were inferior. And in Spain, there were the first kind of blood laws where they traced ethnicity of Jewish residents. And depending on how much Jewish blood they had, the different laws applied to them. So it was not only what he did, it's also the ideas that he brought, as Elaine pointed to.
And, to add to what you're saying, too, is that the idea of how much blood, Jewish blood, well, that certainly has been transferred. Blood quantum has been transferred to the United States, which is a totally European idea. So, I mean, it has its roots and it's growing. And still to this day, and frankly, I have been, how many times have I had non-Native people ask me, and exactly what percentage are you? And as if they're going to measure, are you Indian enough to count or aren't you? So I have to have their permission and their approval. So I think this is another example of what has come along, sort of an unintended side effect. I don't know, but you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I would just say too, like this business, I agree totally that things were exploited, and Columbus can't be totally seen as the total initiator of anything. Like, there were whole systems, but actually he was a part of that system. And when he went there back after he came here, he told them what they could find here, and it was easy pickings for colonial takeover. And the European takeover, there were several, Portugal and Spain and then England, all these colonizing countries, used a rationale, which is what you're kind of talking about. They use this rationale for taking other people's land under the guise of Christianity, and if you weren't Christian, they could take it, knowing full well nobody was Christian that they were talking about and whose lands they were trying to take. So that's really key. And then you dupe people into thinking that this is the case. If you look today at what's going on, there are some people in our that are talking about trying to make it so that that we say the United States is a Christian country. You can see the roots of this still around, like from when the Constitution got formed in 1776, and then when you see that they want to go back to 1776, well, it's important to know what was going on in 1776. When this country separated out from England, the land was an important issue, and how it was gotten was an important issue. And John Marshall, the Supreme Court person, had to say that the doctrine of discovery was inherited by the United States, and it still exists in our Constitution about this doctrine of discovery. So it's a problematic thing that has never been addressed, nor has the papal bull ever been addressed. Those two things are still in place. So they're there for the convenience of taking people's land and keeping it under the false premise. And because they haven't, acknowledged any of the treaties, they've broken every single one of the treaties, even though they talk about, the law, rule of law. Well, they break their own laws with impunity based on whatever privilege that gives. And so I just think that when I think about the impact, think of this impact. Colonization resulted in a wiping out of 90% of the indigenous people here. 90% through disease, through genocidal policies, through massacres and simple taking of land. And that's an injustice, and really it's and then to create a money system that would allow for it to stay. So I think that when you think about that, it is important not to have a man who represents that system, named Columbus, be honored in this country. He represents the worst of who we are, not the best of who we are. It hurts not only indigenous people, I think it hurts us all, that we would not be able to tell the truth, to embark on a path of healing and reconciliation around these things, and begin to teach our children in the schools exactly what happened so it doesn't get repeated. So that people are getting a diverse history of the United States. and understanding that the people who did these things, they believed in it. You know, it's not to demonize them. It's to say that they were misguided, but they believed it. You know, and you can look at today's world and you can see some of these things still playing themselves out. So I just felt really needed to kind of just get that off my chest.
Yeah. Certainly interesting perspectives that you all have been sharing with us. Areas that certainly where there is a blatant agreement, areas that we slightly disagree, but we're still there, you know, not seeing these men as a nice man due to the atrocities and other things that he really practiced in the past. So we'll go to question number 3. Do you think that changing the name of the holiday will change the way Indigenous people are treated and remembered throughout our history? Or is this move largely symbolic?
With all the best intentions, I think at this point it is symbolic. I don't know if as it's going to change things, and certainly change comes slowly, typically. When I think of everything that is not common knowledge about Indigenous people in America, that is why I believe it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a concentrated effort. I also believe that to this day that Indigenous people are regarded as a viable threat, and it all goes back to land, water, mineral rights. Oh, they want their land back. I've experienced this when I've been in conversation with other Native people sitting around a table. Their body language changes. They're like this, it's the land, it's the land. Almost like there's this fear that is just gripping them. It concerns me that people are not aware of Wounded Knee 1973. It concerns me that no one knows who AIM was. It concerns me that only roughly 10% of the population in America is aware of the government-run boarding schools. It concerns me that no one knows who the first vice president of color was, Carl Curtis from the Kaw Nation. It concerns me that people do not know that civil rights, that Jim Crow was first defeated in Alaska by a Tlingit woman, by the Tlingit Nation. Her name was Elizabeth Petrovich. Why don't people know this? These are significant happenings. Why has this been so covered up? I believe I know. It's because nobody wants to address this. We're the 800-pound gorilla in the room. What are they going to say? It's one thing I believe in land acknowledgement. I do. But I think acknowledgement also requires action. So you're acknowledging us. What are you going to do about it? Make space for us in your schools, in your place of work. Make space for us in your head space. Also, are you supporting reconfirmation of treaties? Are you supporting the land back movement? What can you do? Their acknowledgement also requires some restitution of some sort.
Elaine, do you believe that these efforts that you call cover up, do you think this is intentional? The system works that way? Is it intentional?
I absolutely do. I can't, I don't know how to, this sounds very raw. I absolutely do. I believe that there's reasons that we are sidestepped, that we are ignored. There's reasons that no one knows about. I mean, you hear about Indigenous people, Native people, what happened 250 years ago? Well, what about what's happened in the past 100 years, the past 50 years, the last decade? Nobody really hears about that. Are you aware that there was a man from the Navajo Nation? His name is Mark Charles. He's an activist. He's a speaker. He was in Massachusetts within the last several months. Speaking at Gordon College, at any rate, he ran on the independent ticket for president. You could pick him up on YouTube anytime. He would entitle it My Second Cup of Coffee. Why didn't anybody hear about him? Why wasn't this promoted? I never heard on the major media outlets, none of them. I never heard his name mentioned. Although I would like to say that I've heard Elizabeth Warren's name mentioned many times on media outlets, and she is not even Indigenous. And I would like to know why this man, why nobody had him on, why nobody interviewed him. So I'm going to leave that there.
Piggyback on what you're saying, Elena, I don't think people realize the importance of the land grab and what it means to, colonial thinking, but the Dawes Act and all the different ways they made Native people begin to see land as private property. And on a lot of the reservations, there are more than one tribe. And usually they've been people who have been enemies in the past on the same reservation. And this is by plan to keep people from mobilizing, to keep people at odds with each other. I've done a lot of work on the reservation, and I can have so many firsthand stories about how this is playing out today in the real world, even how funding is used and how funding is not getting to the people. It's just really designed to keep Indigenous people impoverished. Most people in America don't know the third world conditions that Native peoples are living in. Like, could you imagine having 14 people living in a mobile trailer without running water and without electricity and having to bring in your portable, propane in? It's like, that's everyday life on the Pine Ridge Reservation and so many others. And, it's just a tragedy that most people don't know. And this is the impact. And the deeper impact is on the psyche. And, I'll be interested later on to hear what Jaleeyah has to say, even about like what she hears about herself in the history in the school in which she's studying right now and how that impacts her. But it's like, I'm just thinking about the self-esteem issue and the fact that so many young people are killing themselves on the reservation, the highest rate of all races in America. And it's not like something that people know much about. It's just so prevalent, this lack of knowledge of Indigenous experience and the lateral violence that it promotes, because then you got federal tribes, going against state tribes, and they're all buying into the quota system that Elena was referring to, and really no other race that people has that to contend with. And then we won't even get into like the even currently there have been still some forced sterilization that has occurred in Alaska with the Indigenous people there. So I just think we have a lot of ways to go, but I don't think it's changing how Native peoples are being treated, just like what Elena was saying. But at least it's a first step to beginning to have a conversation. For Elena and myself and Jaleeyah to be able to be here and talk about this on TV in our communities is important, that we talk about how relevant or irrelevant, like action needs to happen. And we can do that in our own communities and in our own school systems.
I would like to add just like kind of a conversational flow here. I really believe, and if I'm going to quote Greg Deal, he's the member of a Paiute Nation, and he's an activist and an artist. And from TED Talks, I need to just quote him for a moment. He said, the reason to encapsulate this is that our value in the United States and among American people is very, very low. We're not seen as relevant, although people do like, our talking circles, highly colonized version of our talking circles. Yeah. So just to move forward with that, no, we're not seen as being relevant. I want to also make mention of I was talking to, this is he's no longer in the state, but he was a professor at a college. That's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to identify anything any further, anyone. And he made mention to me and said in a scoffing way, "Oh, Indians in Massachusetts, they're all dead anyway." I would say that's a pretty accurate commentary. All right? Yeah. So this is coming from what the most educated progressive state in the United States? Oh, I didn't know that. That's what he had to say. And I'm going to leave it at that.
As part of the younger generation, I know that talking about Indigenous people has become more common, and I think that at least for my generation, it's becoming less of symbolic and more of action steps. Because there are many kids that take charge and take their time to find out about Indigenous people and their background and just learn more about overall Indigenous people. And I think that even though I'm young, that we still have a lot of say and power in what can be taught in school, and that we can give a say to give our opinions and give the thought that Indigenous culture should be taught more in history.
Some of the things that you all described sounds like there is a systemic level issue that's embedded, kind of synonymous with structural racism and the way things have been portrayed and sustained in our society. In other words, whose voices are being heard, whose narrative count, who's telling the story, and for what purpose. That's basically it. So that leads us to the following questions. What actions and/or steps should we take to decolonize and reorganize the curriculum in a way that it not only recognizes, celebrates, and values our students' diverse views and perspectives, but also affirms their heritage and cultural identity?
I do think that history education has gotten a lot better in one way. I think that it's very good at, particularly at Revere High School, at making sure that the mistreatment, the injustice, the oppression is known, at least in a big picture sense. I think it's less good at actually celebrating and taking a real kind of look at the groups that have been mistreated in this way as apart from the terrible things that were done to them. And I think that's something that history education would really benefit from. And as far as steps, I think that there's something called an equity audit that we've done for some of the history classes, where you really go into the curriculum, kind of look at every standard and every point that is being taught, and really, with many different voices, look at what is in there and what's missing. And also to bring students together to talk to them and ask what they are not seeing in their history classes that they would like to see, and what would be important to them. And I think that work has begun, and I think it's ongoing at Revere High School. We definitely could do a better job.
I'd like to comment. I'd just say a couple things. First of all, when you're talking about marginalized groups, or we're not considered an ethnic minority because we are sovereign nations. However, I really think that not only bringing forth what has happened, let's just focus on Indigenous people for the sake of the conversation today, but also we don't want to be seen as perpetual victims. At least I don't. I can't speak for everybody. I want people to know about, wow, look at our cultural values. Look at how we have survived and how we have had to navigate what has happened to us, and the good things that we have done and all the contributions we have made. Because sometimes I really think that victimization becomes the only narrative. And while that is true, and I want people to be aware of it, we're much more than that. Because, and I think it puts us at risk of falling into just a stereotype of, they're the ones, their land got taken and they're just, so, or they're the ones with all the casinos. Yeah. So I think we need to really balance that. And I would like to give a shout out to one of my colleagues, and it was a sheltered history. And I have seen her, what she has written, she does the best job she possibly can for the ELL students of really touching on and discussing and having little projects for them that makes them aware of what happened in the United States in history. And I think she's done an excellent job in trying to make it accessible and palatable to them. So there.
I'm wondering, you know, like how much structured look in implementing that, you know, equity audit is happening in the Revere School. And I'm wondering what, you know, Jaleeyah could say about that, because she's there, and I think she touched on it earlier about how the students can have an impact. And I'm wondering, are they having as big an impact as you would like to have in informing the curriculum? And are parents involved too, you know, in that, in supporting, you know, what support do you have in the school, you know, to look at the curriculum so that you could see the voices in histories of communities of color?
I know that the impact isn't as strong as we would like it to be, but the message is definitely getting heard. We have many sources of just support at the high school. All teachers are open to any ideas you have. They help you get in touch, they help you contact other teachers that can give you possibly a better chance at reaching your target audience. And I think that right now at the pace we're at, it's going well because we're learning more and more as time goes on about Indigenous people and what happened.
It's really glad to hear that. It's just really important, you know, just to see yourself represented in the curriculum and the history is so important. So I'm glad that Revere is on that path. You know, there's only 0.3% Native peoples in Revere at this time. And I think it's cool, too, to look at the history of Revere and, you know, and the New England history of the people there in the first contacts. It's very fascinating reading. And, you know, I'm wondering if anybody in the school would be interested in taking a look at that and looking at, you know, what happened and how the towns and, you know, there's like really interesting things about, you know, who the shaman there that was the sachem for the Pawtucket Confederation of the Abenaki people. He was named Nana Pashamet. And, you know, there's quite a lot of information that you can get about what happened. And there were, you know, Medford and how the different towns, some of them got split off, how Chelsea became defined, all those things is kind of a cool way to look at where people are actually living, can kind of galvanize interest in history like that.
Thank you, Strong Oak, and thank you all for, you know, your critical perspective on this question. It's certainly a question that, as Jaleeyah and Ethan we were just talking about, there's a lot of movements in the school district in this direction. I can tell you that the Equity Advisory Board, through its working group that focus on bias and sensitivity, has been certainly taking a critical look at the curriculum and other materials to really reflect the experiences and the cultural heritage, the language of the minority population in our district. We are not there yet. We have a long way to go, certainly. What you just referred, you were talking about Strong Oak, the idea of teaching our students about the history of Revere. We have a subject, a course called the History of Revere. I'm not sure, I think it's an elective course. So some of these things are certainly covered, but as I said, we have a long way as an institution to really decolonize our curriculum, our textbooks, making sure that our students, the authors of the countries where our students are coming from are also reflected in the curriculum text materials, because it certainly helps them with a pride. It also helps them with their self-discovery and also self-identity. So we're going to move to question 5, which has to do with stature. That's another very controversial topic. And the question reads as follows: where do you stand in terms of the stature debate? Should all Christopher Columbus statues across the United States be taken down? Why or why not?
I think that this is interesting. And I think this gets to the idea of public memory versus history, and that a society gets its ideas about the past, the commonly held ones, from all the stimuli that the average people sort of get in their life. And so statues are one of them, street names, city names, school names, things like that, certainly from media, television, and movies. So in my opinion, I think that we erect statues to show people or things that we value, that we respect, that are important to us as a society. And so now that it's commonly understood Columbus's contribution to the world, it seems to me that keeping them up is sending not a great message. And I do think that though they are of course symbolic, they do impact the way that people think about these things. And I think that one day when the Crazy Horse Memorial is dwarfing Mount Rushmore as people go to visit it, I think that will send another message. So I do think that statues can be important reminders of society's values.
Anyone else would like to weigh in on this issue or add to what Ethan just said?
Well, according to what Ethan said, I agree wholeheartedly with it. What is present and what is not present also is indicative of a society's values. So going even to Mount Rushmore, which is actually Pahasapa, the Black Hills. And I don't know of any Indigenous people. I don't speak only for myself, but I frankly have never met anyone who was happy to have the faces of the presidents chiseled into the side of them. Yeah. So, yeah. And I think that, yes, I'm in favor of removing all the statues of Christopher Columbus as unceremoniously as possible. And I think that's important. But I do like to add, as far as decolonizing, I'm just going to throw this in. I really think it's important for the individual nations, tribal nations, to be working to decolonize for themselves. I think we can do this in a very general way to try to bring recognition to what's happened. And if that means removing statues or whatever else. But also, I really feel that the most effective way to decolonize is what people do in their own reservations, whether that's in the reservation, junior colleges or middle schools, high schools, getting their land back, retaining tribal sovereignty. There's a lot of proactive steps that tribes have done and continue to do to decolonize. So I think it's two-pronged. Maybe I've kind of gone down a different rabbit hole, but I just wanted to mention that.
Just to piggyback too on what you're saying, Elena, what I know is that, the Pahasapa, the Black Hills, the indigenous people there refused to take money for it from the U.S. government because that would make them private property. It would diminish the land. So in the world of reparations and that, I just don't see how if Indigenous people took the land as an ownership, then we become completely colonized, because land cannot be owned. It's its own self. In fact, the cardinal piece of information for Indigenous and traditional elders and what they teach is that it was the plants and animals who were our teachers and not the other way around. And that makes sense, because it was all here before we got here. And spiritually, they believed, and we believed, that the animals and plants, agreed to help us out once we got here. And that there was a equitable connection. And in all of the original instructions, it talks about Mother Earth having the same rights as a human being. So she should not be owned by anyone. And if you look at the land trust, there's not one piece of land in America that is not owned, and not one piece of land in America that can't be taken by eminent domain. This is a highly significant structural issue and problem that needs to be addressed, and it affects everyone. Because everybody, your land, that you may have a mortgage on it, but it says that you're a tenant in common or in entirety. You do not own that land. They can come and take it by eminent domain. So like that eminent domain issue is the way in which the land ownership is controlled by the structure that's in place. So I don't know how we can have equity without looking at that stuff and really understanding, like, what reparations could you give to me and Indigenous people? You'd have to go back somewhere else. You couldn't be here. That's not even practical or even desirable. It's like more like we need to look at a way to share it equitably. And think about non-ownership of land. It could be done, but it would shake up the way in which the structure operates.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I guess, though, also, I feel that in tribes, what I said, in buying back, getting the land back, per se, that's a reclamation of who they are, who their ancestors are. They don't, under the auspices of the tribe, it is not dealt with the same way as with the people that owned it. It's just the way of accessing it. And I had even heard a man say, we went to the elders and they said, I know we don't really like this, but do what you have to do, kind of a thing. So I really feel that their view of ownership, this is for them, a way for them to perpetuate themselves, the culture, the language. So I understand what they're doing. I also know that as Native people, we're taught to be humble. And with humility comes the real equity. And that's why we're not to be self-promoting and braggadocious about ourselves, correct? And yet I know that it's a really hard line to walk. As far as you have to function in a couple worlds, we've all heard that, but it's the truth. So how do you take this that's been very contorted, and how do you make that work, right? As a Native person, how do you make it work? So I think that's the crux of the issue, and that's what they're trying to do. And if that really enables them to decolonize and get back to who they were, then I kind of think that's what they have to do, if you know what I mean.
Well, I kind of do know what you mean, but it's, I belong to a land justice affinity group that's composed of, I'm the Indigenous advisor for that group, especially, a lot of the Quaker community is looking for ways to bring the land back to Indigenous people, but not in that ownership capacity. Like in the tribe that I'm a part of, we have land, but we invite everybody to share in it. It's about making collective people from all cultures be able to come together. How can we get rid of racism if we don't find a way to be equitable with each other? And like for myself, when the land comes into play, if you had collective ownership of it, and then you had sharing of it, and you had a decision-making process that was equitable for everyone involved and resolve and had the ability to resolve conflict in a good way based on the original instructions. There are these models out there where we're trying to do those things. So, and that's actually what our Walking in Balance curriculum is about. It talks about that a lot, and how to do that, and how to change our mindset about how we look at the world, because everyone's been colonized. I've been colonized. I mean, there's no way I had to go to the Western school system. I got colonized, and so it's hard to get rid of all that. And tribes have been colonized, and so we have a lot of work to do on all fronts.
Anyone else would like to add or a comment or agree or disagree, or this has been an interesting discussion. I'm really enjoying it. If not, we will go to the following question. On June 21, 2021, President Biden issued the first ever presidential proclamation on Indigenous Peoples Day. While this was a great first step, critics would say it doesn't go far enough because Christopher Columbus continues to be celebrated. A subset of that question is, collectively, what can we do in our state, local governments, cities, towns, and municipalities to support the establishment of Indigenous Peoples Day? That goes to anyone.
I do think that Indigenous Peoples Day, President giving that proclamation is great, but I do think that something needs to be done about Columbus Day. And I don't necessarily see it as make Columbus Day into Indigenous Peoples Day. I think that's setting up more conflict for people. It sort of gives people a narrative of taking one thing away in order to, quote unquote, give it to someone else, which is ironic given the history, and certainly that's more apt than it seems on the surface. But I do think that if we go back to the original reason for Columbus Day, if it's for Italian Americans, then certainly there are better options for Italian Americans to be celebrated, even if they want to keep it to the sea, right? One thing, Columbus believed that the earth was much smaller than it actually is. He didn't even think it was round, although everyone already knew it was round. He thought it was shaped like a pear. He thought Cuba was Japan until the day he died. He believed Cuba was Japan. So, there's another fella. His name is Giovanni da Verrazzano. He is also from a kingdom that was 400 years later became Italy, because there was no Italy for 400 years after Columbus first sailed. Now this fella, right, if we want to talk about discovering quote unquote America, as it's often said, he sailed not too long after Columbus, but he landed in Virginia. He sailed up the coast. He met some native groups. He met them. He had a nice meal with them, and he moved on. He sailed to Cape Cod. He stopped at, legend has it, Rhode Island, and said it looks like the island of Rhodes, and that's why Rhode Island is called Rhode Island. So I think Verrazzano only gets a bridge in New York City, but perhaps it could be Verrazzano Day, and I think that would be a much nicer way to handle it.
Anyone else?
I think that implementing Indigenous Peoples Day, just even if it's small lessons, it can make a big impact, because I know that there are many kids that don't know a lot about it or don't know about it at all, but there are also some that do know about it, and they can educate their own peers, and they can help bring light on the subject. And just, I know it seems like a small step, but eventually I think it'll get to make a big impact.
Thank you. Anybody else?
To go far enough, it would be to say we no longer, as a federal government, want to support Columbus, recognizing that he represents a time in history of great oppression, and that's not how we are today. That would be good.
Certainly. I just want to, thank you so much for sharing with us these powerful insights. This conversation has certainly been very informative and meaningful to all of us. I truly appreciate all the things that you have said. There are areas that our panelists agreed. There are areas that they slightly disagree, but this is what makes great debate, great discussions. And it's all about bringing, thought-provoking, perspectives to really make us think critically. And so I'm glad that throughout this conversation and discussion, we were able to see that. I truly appreciate it. Now, either Strong Oak or Elijah, will recite a poem for us. Reciting poems, actually, one of the things that I really like. So I was hoping that one of you could recite a poem for us.
The title of this poem is The Land. We fight over the land.
We claim it through greed or the patterns of decades and the entitlement of our fathers, whose conquering spirits were not restrained by right so much as influenced by privilege.
So still we try to claim what maybe was never ours, but which we think in the gaining the ownership of is justified.
We fight over a piece of soil or a resource that registers as gold in hands that would misuse if they could.
Or we fight over waters that have ever sprung and flowed since our world first hung in this space we call home.
And place becomes a thing that we have borrowed, that we think in the borrowing we can now call our own.
Yes, we fight over the land, over who was here before us and who might have stolen what was not theirs to take.
And often our grief is justified, as our ancestors' fears mingle in the rivers of a land bleeding yet.
Yet I wonder if the earth, if it had a voice that we could hear, might remind us of its natural state before any of us measured our claim.
I wonder if we all might possess a little peace if we saw it as something borrowed.
I hope that the wisdom shared by our panelists have increased our understanding of the importance of Indigenous Peoples Day. Their life journey, sacrifices, resilience, legacy, heritage, and all the contributions they have brought to medicine and food industry. I also hope that this discussion will serve as a catalyst to inspire students, educators, and members of our community to advocate for the rights and dignity of Indigenous people throughout our country and the world. Last but not the least, as always, I would like to thank Revere TV for hosting us and our distinguished panelists in a space where all ideas, experiences, and perspectives matter. Thank you for watching, and happy Indigenous Peoples Day to all of us.